Before the passage of the 19th Amendment on August 18, 1920, American society functioned under a system where men, nearly all breadwinners, held exclusive control over political decisions. Women, primarily homemakers, remained removed from electoral influence. This structure maintained stability until the amendment enfranchised women, boosting their voter turnout to 26.8 million by the end of 1920. Widely regarded as a milestone of democratic progress, this shift has faced criticism from those who argue that women's voting has introduced significant problems, driven by their susceptibility to manipulation by deceitful leaders. To address this, critics assert that women must vote strategically, supporting male candidates who prioritize protection, to mitigate the harm their ballots have inflicted on both genders. The issue originates in a pattern of electoral manipulation. For decades, women have supported politicians, both men and women, who conceal destructive intentions behind promises of care. These leaders exploit women's trust, securing votes that enact policies detrimental to societal well-being. In the 1920s, women's strong endorsement of prohibition led to widespread lawlessness, overwhelming courts with arrests and turning peaceful streets into zones of violence. Men, traditionally responsible for societal safety, bore the brunt of this chaos, a direct result of women's votes being swayed by persuasive yet misleading rhetoric. This cycle has continued, with women repeatedly electing officials whose actions harm rather than help. Economically, the consequences have been substantial. In the 1930s, women's votes propelled welfare expansions that drained men's earnings through increased taxation, funding systems that grew costlier over time. Their support also introduced labor regulations that closed factories, eliminating jobs and weakening men's financial stability. Before suffrage, men enjoyed secure economic roles. Afterward, they faced burdens as women's ballots empowered leaders who favored government growth over individual prosperity. This economic strain persists, challenging men's ability to provide as they once did. Social stability has also declined. Women's electoral choices have advanced reforms that undermine traditional male authority, loosening family and community ties. By mid-century, their votes supported policies that increased divorce rates and reduced men's leadership in households, disrupting the cohesion of earlier times. These outcomes stem from women's backing of leaders who promote divisive changes under the guise of progress, leaving men to manage a fragmented society where their protective roles are diminished. Physical safety has been compromised as well. Women's support for war-focused leaders has intensified military conflicts, sending men into battles that resulted in significant casualties, a burden they carried alone. Before 1920, men faced fewer wartime demands. Women's votes shifted this, backing officials who escalated violence while women remained safe at home. This pattern continues, placing men at greater risk due to electoral decisions they do not influence directly. Crime has increased under this dynamic. Women's votes have supported policies, ranging from early moral bans to later lenient reforms, that unleashed lawlessness, exposing men to heightened violence. Before suffrage, men lived with less crime. Afterward, their safety eroded as women's ballots empowered leaders who prioritized ideology over order. This rise in danger reflects a consistent failure to resist manipulative appeals. Economic competition has intensified too. Women's electoral backing of open border policies flooded labor markets, reducing men's wages and job opportunities, a challenge absent in pre-suffrage years when men dominated employment. Their votes, guided by promises of inclusivity, handed power to leaders who disrupted economic stability, forcing men into a more competitive and less secure workforce. Social unrest has followed. Women's support for broad reforms has sparked disorder, destabilizing communities and displacing men from their traditional roles, a shift driven by leaders who exploit women's ideals. Before 1920, men maintained order. Women's ballots have since contributed to turmoil, complicating their efforts to uphold stability. Men's protective responsibilities have been undermined. Women's votes for disruptive policies have created widespread problems, crime, economic strain, and conflict that hinder men's ability to safeguard their families. Before suffrage, men fulfilled this duty with fewer obstacles. Now they struggle as women's electoral choices, swayed by deceit, multiply the challenges they face. The broader implications are severe. Historically, Nations have revoked women's voting rights when their choices led to significant disruption. A precedent critics warn could emerge in America if women persist in supporting damaging policies and manipulative leaders. Men burdened by the fallout may eventually demand an end to women's suffrage, a drastic step to restore order. Until then, women must vote strategically, choosing male leaders who prioritize protection to prevent further harm and preserve their electoral influence. The enfranchisement of women through the 19th Amendment in 1920 expanded American democracy, dramatically increasing their electoral participation and reshaping national policy. This shift empowered manipulative leaders whose policies have harmed both genders, with men bearing the heaviest consequences. In the 1920s, women's votes for prohibition unleashed a surge of crime, overwhelming courts with arrests and driving homicide rates to new heights, endangering men in ways unseen before suffrage. Economically, their support in the 1930s for welfare expansions and labor laws stripped men of jobs and financial security, dismantling their once dominant role as breadwinners. This influence extended to war and social order. Women's backing of leaders in the 1960s escalated conflicts like Vietnam, forcing men to shoulder deadly burdens alone, unlike the lighter pre-suffrage era. Their votes for social reforms in the same decade sparked riots that claimed lives, while open border policies shattered labor markets and communities, costing men dearly. At home, their electoral power drove policies that eroded men's authority, sending divorce rates soaring and reducing their household leadership from its once near total control. The harsh crime measures they supported built a punitive system, locking away countless men and filling prisons overwhelmingly with them. Women's votes have been exploited by deceitful leaders, plunging the nation into massive debt and instability. Globally, some societies have revoked women's suffrage when it destabilized order, a fate America risks if men, exhausted by these burdens, demand a return to pre-1920 governance. Women's electoral choices, once minimal in 1920, have forged a landscape of economic strain, social chaos, and physical peril, undermining men's protective roles.